I never thought the person who would abandon me the most would be my own sister. Not when I was lying in a hospital bed. Not when the doctors were discussing my surgery like I wasn't even in the room. And definitely not when the medical bills started arriving faster than I could even open them. But that's exactly when she disappeared. And when I asked for help, she looked me in the eye and said something I will never forget. Your health problems are not my responsibility. At the time, I didn't realize those words would completely change my life, because what followed wasn't just about healthcare costs fought, unpaid bills, or financial stress. It was about family abandonment and a kind of betrayal I didn't know people were capable of. My name is Hannah. Until 2 years ago, I lived a pretty ordinary life in Oregon. I worked as a dental hygienist in a small clinic outside Portland. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I had a modest apartment, a reliable car, and a quiet routine that felt stable. More importantly, I had my family. At least, I thought I did. My sister Melissa and I were only 3 years apart. Growing up, we were inseparable. We shared a bedroom until high school. We borrowed each other's clothes. When our parents divorced, we promised each other we'd always stick together, no matter what happened. Melissa was the confident one, outgoing, charismatic, the type of person who could walk into any room and instantly become the center of attention. I was the opposite, quiet, careful, the planner. She used to joke that I was the responsible one who would keep her out of trouble. Back then, it felt like a compliment. Looking back, it feels like a warning. By our early 30s, life had taken us in different directions. Melissa moved to Seattle and married a tech entrepreneur named Daniel. Within a few years, they had a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Glass walls, a rooftop deck, 2 luxury cars parked in the driveway. Meanwhile, I stayed in Oregon. My life wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable. We still talked every week, sometimes longer. At least that's how it seemed. But slowly, things began to change. Melissa started mentioning money a lot. Her husband's business had taken off. They were investing in real estate, traveling internationally, posting pictures from places like Iceland and Italy. Every time we spoke, she sounded a little more distant, a little less like the sister I grew up with. Still, I never imagined family abandonment was even possible between us. Not after everything we'd been through, not after the promises we made as kids. Then, one night, everything changed. It started with a pain in my chest that I assumed was stress. By the next morning, I was in the emergency room, and within a week, I was facing medical bills that would change everything. That was the moment I truly began to understand what healthcare costs fought really meant in the United States. Even with insurance, the deductibles and out-of-network charges piled up faster than I could process. Within a month, I was looking at nearly $60,000 in medical debt, and the surgery hadn't even happened yet. The stress made it difficult to sleep. Every night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, calculating numbers in my head. How many extra shifts could I work? How much could I cut from my expenses? How long before my savings ran out? But the bigger fear wasn't just money. It was the feeling of being completely alone in the middle of it. That's when I decided to call Melissa. At first, the conversation felt normal. She answered with the same cheerful tone she always used. "Hey, stranger," she laughed. "How's Oregon treating you?" For a moment, I almost forgot why I had called. We talked about small things first, her new kitchen renovation, a trip she and Daniel were planning to Greece, their golden retriever that apparently had its own Instagram account now. Then I told her about the hospital. There was a pause on the phone, not a long one, but long enough that I noticed it. "Oh, wow," she said finally. "That sounds stressful." I explained the situation, the upcoming procedure, the growing bills, the way I had been trying to fight healthcare costs and felt like I was drowning. I wasn't asking for a huge amount, just a temporary loan to help stabilize things, something I could slowly repay over time. Another silence. This one was longer. When Melissa finally spoke again, her voice sounded different, careful, distant. You know, Daniel and I tried to keep family and finances separate. I blinked. I'm not asking for charity, I said quickly. I just need a little help until I recover. She sighed softly. Medical situations can get complicated. The words felt strangely rehearsed, like she had already decided her answer before I even finished speaking. Still, I tried to stay calm. We're sisters, I reminded her quietly. We've always been there for each other. Another pause. And that was when I heard the first hint of something that felt like betrayal. Well, we're not really in a position to get involved. I was too shocked to respond at first. This was the same sister who once called me crying because she overdrafted her bank account by $300. The same sister I had helped pay rent for during her first year in Seattle. Back then, helping her never felt like a burden, because that's what family does, or at least that's what I believed. But suddenly, the idea of family abandonment no longer felt impossible. It felt like something quietly unfolding right in front of me. And the worst part? That conversation wasn't even the most painful one we were about to have, because a week later, Melissa called me back, and what she said next turned a difficult situation into something far darker, something that made the healthcare costs fought feel like the smallest problem in my life. A week passed after that conversation. 7 long days of medical appointments, insurance calls, and unopened envelopes stacking up on my kitchen table. Melissa didn't text. She didn't check in. Not even a quick message asking how I was doing. That silence alone felt heavy. But then, on the 8th day, my phone rang. Her name flashed across the screen. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe she had talked to Daniel. Maybe she reconsidered. Maybe she realized this wasn't just about money. It was about helping her sister through the worst moment of her life. I answered on the second ring. "Hey," I said softly. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Hi, Hannah. I've been thinking about our conversation." Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. I didn't know why yet, but I could feel it. "I talked to Daniel," she continued. "He had some thoughts about your situation." That phrasing alone made it sound like a business meeting instead of a family conversation. I waited. Well, what did he say? Another pause. Not awkward, calculated. Daniel thinks it's important that people take responsibility for their own medical situations. The words felt strangely cold. I gripped the phone tighter. "I am taking responsibility," I said. "I'm working, I'm talking to the hospital billing department, I'm trying to fight healthcare costs wherever I can." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she let out a small sigh. "You know what Daniel said?" "What?" "He said helping financially might create unhealthy expectations." For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. Unhealthy expectations? "Yeah," she replied calmly. "Like if we help once, you might expect help again in the future." The room suddenly felt very quiet. This wasn't just hesitation anymore. This was something else, something colder, something that felt unmistakably like betrayal. I swallowed hard. "I'm asking for help during a medical emergency," I said carefully. "This isn't a habit." "I know," Melissa replied quickly, "but Daniel is very firm about these things." There it was again. Daniel. Daniel thinks. Daniel believes. Daniel decided. It sounded less like my sister speaking and more like someone repeating instructions. I tried one more time. "Melissa, the surgery alone is going to cost more than my yearly salary. I'm doing everything I can to fight healthcare costs, but I'm running out of options." Silence filled the line again. Then she said something that changed everything. "Well, maybe this is a lesson about planning for emergencies." I felt something inside my chest crack, a slow, painful realization. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was family abandonment, and it was happening while I was at my most vulnerable. But Melissa wasn't finished, because the next thing she said was even worse. You know, she continued casually, Daniel mentioned that if you're struggling with the bills, maybe you should consider selling some of your assets. Assets? I almost laughed. My assets? You have a car, right? Yes, the car I need to get to work. Well, sometimes sacrifices are necessary. For a long moment, I didn't speak. I just sat there, staring at the wall, feeling the full weight of her words. This wasn't the sister who once promised we'd have each other's backs. This was someone else entirely, someone who had chosen comfort over compassion, and that realization hurt more than any hospital bill ever could. But what I didn't know yet was that Melissa's role in my healthcare costs-fought situation was about to get much worse, because 2 weeks later, I discovered something that turned her cold indifference into undeniable betrayal. And once I learned the truth, the story of family abandonment took a turn I never expected. 2 weeks later, I learned something that completely changed how I saw my sister. And it didn't come from Melissa. It came from our Aunt Carol. She called me on a Sunday afternoon when I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by hospital paperwork, insurance appeals, payment plans, more statements I was trying to organize while continuing to fight healthcare costs that seemed to multiply every week. "Sweetheart," Aunt Carol said gently when I answered, "how are you holding up?" "Oh, learning the exciting world of medical billing." She didn't laugh. Instead, her voice grew hesitant. "Hannah, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Melissa told the family that you're refusing help." "Refusing help?" "Yes," Aunt Carol continued carefully. "She said you're being stubborn about accepting reasonable advice." That's not what happened. My hands started shaking slightly. "I didn't have help offered," I said quietly. "She refused to help at all." Another pause on the line. Then Aunt Carol said something that made the situation even worse. "Well, that's not how she explained it." Of course it wasn't, because what Melissa had been telling the rest of the family painted a completely different picture. Apparently, she had been describing my situation like this: that I had poor financial planning, that I had ignored good advice, and that I was too proud to accept reasonable solutions. And somehow she had framed herself as the concerned sister trying to help. That was the moment the full weight of betrayal finally hit me. Not only had she refused to help when I was struggling to fight healthcare costs, she had quietly rewritten the story so she wouldn't look heartless. And that realization hurt in a way I can barely explain. Because this wasn't just family abandonment anymore. It was reputation damage. It was manipulation. It was someone protecting their image at the expense of the truth. Aunt Carol's voice softened. "Hannah, are you saying Melissa never offered help?" "No," I replied slowly. "She told me I should sell my car." Carol inhaled sharply. "That's not what she told us." Of course it wasn't. Melissa had described the situation as if she and Daniel had offered financial guidance that I had stubbornly rejected. Meanwhile, the reality was that I was drowning in medical debt, trying desperately to fight healthcare costs, while my sister, who lived in a multi-million-dollar house, refused to even consider helping. But the worst part hadn't happened yet, because during that same call, Aunt Carol mentioned something else, something small, something she probably didn't realize would change everything. "Oh," she added casually, "Melissa also mentioned that she's been under stress because Daniel's company is investing heavily in healthcare startups right now." My brain froze. Healthcare startups? Yes, something about insurance technology and hospital billing systems. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. While I was drowning in medical bills, while I was desperately trying to fight healthcare costs, my sister's husband was literally making money in the healthcare industry. The irony was almost surreal, and suddenly Melissa's cold attitude started to make a disturbing kind of sense. Because if the system was working so well for them, why would they ever question it? That night, I sat alone in my apartment thinking about everything. The bills, the lies, the quiet family abandonment, and the slow, calculated betrayal. Something inside me shifted. Not anger,
not revenge, just clarity. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something important. If Melissa wanted to control the story, maybe it was time the truth started telling itself, and the opportunity for that came sooner than I ever expected.
That night, I didn't sleep much. But for the first time in weeks, it wasn't because of the medical bills. It was because something inside my mind had shifted. Until that point, I had spent all my energy trying to fight healthcare costs, negotiating with billing departments, filing insurance appeals, calling hospital administrators who transferred me endlessly between departments. Every conversation felt like hitting another brick wall. But now there was something else on my mind: the truth. Melissa had told the family a version of events that made her look supportive and reasonable. Meanwhile, I looked like the irresponsible sister who refused advice. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it felt. Because if there's one thing I've learned about family abandonment, it's that it rarely happens loudly. It happens quietly, through small distortions of reality, through carefully chosen words that slowly rewrite the narrative. And Melissa was very good at controlling narratives. She always had been. Growing up, she could charm teachers into believing almost anything. She once convinced our parents that I had broken a lamp she knocked over during an argument. Back then, I thought it was just a childish mistake. Now it felt like a pattern that had finally escalated into something that looked very much like betrayal. Still, I wasn't interested in dramatic confrontations. I didn't want screaming phone calls or messy family arguments. Those kinds of explosions rarely reveal the truth. They just create more confusion. So instead, I decided to do something much quieter. I started documenting everything: every medical bill, every hospital statement, every insurance denial, every payment plan proposal, the entire paper trail of my attempt to fight healthcare costs. At first, I told myself it was purely practical. If I ever needed legal advice or financial assistance, having organized documentation could help. But as the days passed, the folder on my laptop kept growing, and something interesting began to happen. The story became very clear, not emotionally, logically. Dates, numbers, phone call records, written statements. When you line those things up, they tell a very different story than Melissa had been telling the family. And that clarity gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. Not revenge, just control over my own narrative. Meanwhile, Melissa continued living her life exactly as before. Vacation photos appeared on social media, new kitchen appliances, weekend wine tastings, and occasionally small posts about family values or supporting loved ones during difficult times. Those posts used to make my stomach twist, but now they had a different effect. They simply became more pieces of the puzzle, more examples of the gap between image and reality, the gap that often exists during moments of family abandonment. Months passed. My surgery happened. Recovery was slow but successful, and slowly, through relentless effort, I continued to fight healthcare costs, negotiating bills down, setting up long-term payment plans, and rebuilding my financial stability piece by piece. But Melissa never reached out again, not to check on my recovery, not to ask about the surgery, not even a simple message. The silence itself said everything. By that point, the betrayal no longer shocked me. What surprised me instead was what happened next, because about 4 months after my surgery, our extended family decided to hold a large gathering, a summer reunion at my Aunt Carol's lake house. Dozens of relatives, cousins, uncles, grandparents, and for the first time since everything happened, Melissa and I would be in the same room. I almost turned my car around twice on the way there. The idea of walking into a room full of relatives, knowing that many of them had already heard her version of the story, made my stomach twist.
but I reminded myself why I came, not for confrontation, just clarity. Aunt Carol's lake house sat on the edge of a quiet lake about 2 hours outside the city. When I arrived, the backyard was already full. Kids running around the dock, uncles arguing about grilling techniques, my cousins laughing around a long wooden table. For a moment, it almost felt normal, until I saw Melissa. She was standing near the patio with a glass of wine, talking to a small group of relatives. Designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, perfect hair, perfect smile, the same confident presence she had always carried. When her eyes met mine, she froze for half a second. Then she smiled, a polite smile, the kind you give to a distant acquaintance, not a sister. "Hey, Hannah," she said casually when I walked over. Her tone was light, like nothing had ever happened. "Hi, Melissa." The conversation around us slowed slightly. I could feel it, the quiet curiosity in the air, because even if no one said it directly, people knew something had happened between us. Melissa spoke first. "I heard your surgery went well." The sentence sounded strangely rehearsed. "Yeah," I replied calmly. "It did." She nodded quickly. "That's good." Then she took a sip of wine and added something that made the tension in the air shift instantly. "You know, Daniel and I were worried you might struggle financially after everything." There it was again, the narrative. Subtle, carefully framed, like she was the concerned sister. For a moment, no one spoke. Several relatives were listening now, and I realized something important. Melissa assumed I would stay quiet. She assumed I would protect the same image she had been protecting. But I had spent months learning to fight healthcare costs, months organizing documents, statements, and payment records. And something about that process had changed me. It had taught me something simple. Facts are powerful, especially when people have only heard one side of the story. So instead of arguing, I simply smiled. "Actually," I said gently, "the hospital worked with me a lot." Melissa nodded quickly. "That's good. I'm glad you accepted some financial guidance." Several relatives exchanged confused looks, because that sentence didn't match what I had just said, and that was the moment the quiet tension began to grow. "Well," I continued calmly, "after weeks of trying to fight healthcare costs, the hospital finally approved a payment reduction program." Melissa blinked, probably not expecting the conversation to continue. I kept my tone neutral. No outside financial advice was really involved. A few heads turned toward Melissa, not accusing, just curious, because now there were two different versions of events floating in the same conversation, and people could feel it. Melissa laughed lightly. "Oh, I thought you meant the suggestions Daniel and I made." There it was again, the subtle attempt to reshape reality. But something interesting was happening now. The more she talked, the more complicated the story became, and complicated stories raise questions, questions that slowly reveal truth. I didn't push, I didn't accuse. I simply answered when people asked how I managed to fight healthcare costs after surgery. Payment plans, insurance appeals, hospital assistance programs. Simple facts, nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, just reality. And slowly, over the next hour, something fascinating unfolded. People started asking Melissa questions, not aggressive ones, just natural curiosity. "What kind of advice did you give? Did you help her find those programs? Was Daniel involved with the hospital billing system?" Each question added a tiny crack to the image she had built, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, the quiet weight of family abandonment started shifting away from me, because when the truth is calm, consistent, and documented, betrayal eventually exposes itself, even without a single argument.
By the end of the afternoon, something had clearly changed. No one had raised their voice. No one had accused anyone of lying. But the atmosphere around Melissa felt different. People were watching her more carefully. listening more closely to what she said. Because once two conflicting stories exist in the same room, people naturally begin searching for the truth. And the truth usually reveals itself through small details, tiny inconsistencies, moments where the narrative stops lining up. That's exactly what started happening. Later that evening, several relatives gathered around the long dining table inside the lake house. Dinner plates, half-finished glasses of lemonade and wine, easy family conversation drifting between travel stories and childhood memories. For a while, everything felt relaxed again, until my cousin Mark asked a simple question. "So, Hannah," he said, leaning back in his chair, "how bad were the medical bills in the end?" The room went quiet. Not awkwardly, just curious. I answered honestly. Before negotiations, almost 80,000. A few people gasped. "That's insane," someone muttered. I nodded. It took months to fight healthcare costs and reduce them. Then Mark turned toward Melissa. "I thought you and Daniel helped her figure some of that out." Melissa's smile flickered, just for a second. "Well, we tried to give guidance," she said carefully. "What kind of guidance?" Aunt Carol asked gently. The question wasn't confrontational, but it was direct. Melissa shifted in her seat. "Well, things like budgeting and managing debt responsibly." That answer landed awkwardly in the room, because everyone sitting there knew something important. Melissa and Daniel lived in a multi-million-dollar home. They vacationed internationally several times a year. Their idea of budgeting advice suddenly sounded a little detached from reality. But the moment that truly changed everything came from someone Melissa hadn't expected, our grandfather. He had been quiet most of the evening, just listening, watching. Finally, he spoke. "Melissa," he said slowly, "did you help your sister financially during her surgery?" The question was simple, clear, impossible to spin. Melissa hesitated. For the first time all day, she didn't answer immediately. "Well, Daniel and I try to keep financial boundaries with family." Grandpa nodded thoughtfully. "I see." He took a sip of tea before continuing. "You know, when your grandmother had cancer years ago, the entire family contributed to help cover her treatments." The room went completely silent. No one interrupted him. "We didn't call it charity," he added quietly. "We called it family." Those words hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. Melissa stared down at the table. For the first time all day, she didn't try to correct the story. She didn't try to reshape the narrative, because there wasn't really anything left to say. Over the next hour, conversations slowly shifted away from her. People talked with me more, asked about my recovery, about how I managed to fight healthcare costs after surgery. And something subtle but powerful happened. The weight of family abandonment that I had been carrying for months quietly moved somewhere else. Not onto Melissa exactly, but onto the reality of what she had chosen. Because once the truth becomes visible, betrayal loses its ability to hide behind polite stories. No one attacked her, no one shamed her, but the change in how people looked at her was impossible to miss. The image she had carefully built, the supportive sister offering wise advice, had quietly collapsed. And the most interesting part, I didn't have to destroy it. All I did was tell the truth. And sometimes that's all karma needs. The reunion ended quietly. No dramatic arguments, no explosive confrontations, just a slow, uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere that everyone could feel, but no one openly discussed. When I left Aunt Carol's lake house that evening, the sun was already setting over the water. I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting the engine. For months, I had imagined that moment differently. I thought if the truth ever came out, I would feel victorious, relieved, maybe even satisfied. But the reality felt calmer than that, because revenge had never really been the point. All I ever wanted was for the truth to exist somewhere outside my own head, and now it did. During the long drive home, my phone buzzed once, a message from Melissa. I almost didn't open it, but eventually curiosity won. The text was short. I didn't expect you to talk about the bills like that today. I stared at the screen for a moment, then I typed a simple response. I just told the truth. She didn't reply, and honestly, that was fine, because by that point, something inside me had already changed. The months after my surgery had been difficult. Between recovery and trying to fight healthcare costs, my life had felt like a constant uphill battle. But that process had also forced me to grow stronger in ways I never expected. I learned how complicated the healthcare system really is. I learned how many people in America quietly fight healthcare costs every single day. And I learned something else that was harder to accept. Sometimes the people you expect to stand beside you simply don't. That realization is painful, but it's also clarifying, because once you recognize family abandonment for what it is, you stop waiting for people to become someone they've already shown they are not. Over the next few months, my life slowly stabilized. The hospital approved a long-term payment plan. Insurance finally covered part of the procedure after several appeals. Little by little, the mountain of bills became manageable. The battle to fight healthcare costs wasn't easy, but it was possible. And surprisingly, my relationships with the rest of my family actually grew stronger, not because anyone took sides, but because honesty tends to create stronger connections than carefully protected images. Melissa and I still speak occasionally, birthdays, holiday messages, polite conversations, but the closeness we once had never fully returned, and maybe that's okay, because trust, once broken by betrayal, rarely returns to its original shape. Still, I don't hate her. I don't wish anything bad for her. What happened taught me something far more valuable than anger ever could. It taught me that resilience doesn't always come from the people you expect. Sometimes it comes from within. Sometimes it comes from learning how to stand on your own when family abandonment forces you to. And sometimes it comes from simply refusing to let someone else control your story. Looking back now, the hardest part of the entire experience wasn't the surgery. It wasn't even the financial stress of trying to fight healthcare costs. The hardest part was realizing that the person I trusted most had chosen comfort over compassion. That kind of betrayal changes you, but it also teaches you exactly who you are and who you're capable of becoming. So now I'm curious. If you were in my situation and your own family refused to help during a medical crisis, what would you have done?